Welcome to U.S. History since 1877. In this course, you will survey the major themes, events, and ideas of American history after Reconstruction.
I'm Jordan O'Connell, History and Government Instructor at Northeast Iowa Community College. This lecture distills a decade of my written notes taken from Alan Brinkley's The Unfinished Nation, The American Yawp, and our course-assigned OpenStax U.S. History textbook. This lecture focuses on American war capacity from Midway to Hiroshima. The core question is this: which force decides more in World War? The famous battle, the factory schedule behind it, or the state capacity that can replace loss faster than the enemy? The core competency is to outline the major American military contributions to the multi-front effort to defeat the Axis powers. Which force decides more in World War? The famous battle, the factory schedule behind it, or the state capacity that can replace loss faster than the enemy? American contribution to Axis defeat rested on mobilizing shipyards, steel mills, railroads, laboratories, aircraft plants, farms, and training systems on a scale large enough to sustain global war. Agencies such as the War Production Board, Warshipping Administration, and Army Service Forces coordinated output after Pearl Harbor. Liberty ships reached the water in record time. Aircraft production soared from fewer than 20,000 planes in 1941 to nearly 100,000 in 1944. And tanks, trucks, radios, artillery, and ammunition moved to both American units and Allied forces. Allied strategy then determined how that capacity would be used. Roosevelt, Churchill, and their staffs accepted a Germany-first approach while still maintaining major U.S. naval and marine operations in the Pacific. The combined chiefs of staff managed this through conferences at Arcadia, Casablanca, Tehran, and Yalta. American power entered the war as materiel and coordination at once, supplying the coalition while helping decide where force would concentrate first. The battlefield victories that followed depended on that earlier build-out. Lend-Lease moved trucks, locomotives, canned meat, aviation fuel, boots, and communications gear to allies, while American industry shortened the time between loss and replacement with escort carriers, landing craft, jeeps, bulldozers, and field radios. Every convoy route, airstrip, and invasion beach consumed fuel, spare engines, medical kits, and rations at rates that only a huge logistical system could sustain. The battle list rests on that machinery. The Pacific Theater demonstrates how quickly capacity and intelligence could alter the balance of power. At the Battle of Midway in June 1942, U.S. codebreakers and Station HIS152 under Commander Joseph Rochefort helped identify the target of the Japanese operation, allowing Admiral Chester Nimitz to position carriers northeast of Midway Atoll. Carrier warfare, not battleship line combat, determined the result. American aircraft from USS Enterprise, USS Hornet, and USS Yorktown struck Japanese carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and later Hiryu, destroying 4 fleet carriers and many trained aviators. Japan could replace hulls more easily than it could replace experienced carrier crews, deck teams, and pilots. Midway therefore shifted strategic initiative in the Pacific. It did not end the war, but it halted Japanese expansion and gave the United States the chance to move from defense to offense. Midway also exposed the technical side of naval power. Dive bombers found the Japanese carriers during a narrow window when decks were crowded with fueled and armed aircraft being reconfigured for another strike, which made the damage catastrophic once bombs hit. Yorktown itself had been repaired at Pearl Harbor in days after Coral Sea damage, and a reminder that repair yards and dry docks counted almost as much as pilots. American industry soon widened that advantage with Essex-class carriers, escort carriers, replacement aircraft, and expanded pilot training pipelines. Japan entered 1942 with formidable striking power. By late 1943, the United States was bringing new hulls, radar sets, and trained aviators into service at a pace Tokyo could not match. That offensive phase developed through island hopping. Rather than assault every Japanese position, U.S. planners selected key islands whose airfields and harbors could support the next advance, while bypassing heavily fortified strongholds that would wither under isolation. Guadalcanal in 1942-1943, Tarawa in 1943, the Marshalls and Marianas in 1944, and Iwo Jima and Okinawa in 1945 marked successive stages of approach toward Japan. Each campaign required amphibious shipping, naval gunfire, carrier air cover, Seabee construction battalions, medical evacuation chains, and coordinated Army Marine Command. Captured islands became bomber bases and logistics nodes. The Marianas were especially important because B-29 bombers could reach the Japanese home islands from Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. American naval contribution involved more than brave crews at sea. It depended on repair docks at Pearl Harbor and the West Coast, oilers that could refuel task forces underway, and a submarine campaign that cut Japanese merchant shipping. U.S. submarines sank large portions of Japan's merchant marine, reducing fuel, food, and raw material flow to the empire. By 1945, Japan's industrial base was being strangled by maritime loss even before atomic bombs were used. War contribution in the Pacific therefore combined battle victory, movement control, and economic attrition. Seabees and naval construction battalions turned capture into usable position. On islands such as Guadalcanal, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, they built airstrips, fuel depots, roads, hospitals, and storage areas under combat conditions. The Marianas Campaign in 1944 then opened the way for the 20th Air Force to launch B-29 missions against the Japanese home islands. From Tinian, enormous runways and bomb storage zones supported strategic bombing at ranges earlier bases could not sustain. In that sense, island hopping was an engineering chain as much as a combat sequence. Each conquest had to be converted into a functioning air and supply complex before the next move paid off. In Europe, the largest single American battlefield contribution came through the opening of a Western front. The United States first fought in North Africa in Operation Torch in November 1942, then joined the invasion of Sicily and the campaign in Italy in 1943. Those operations gave U.S. forces combat experience and tied down Axis resources, but they did not satisfy Soviet demands for a cross-channel invasion. Operation Overlord finally did that. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, as Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, oversaw a force built from American, British, Canadian, and other Allied formations. The D-Day invasion on June 6, 1944, required extraordinary planning. Landing craft production, meteorological forecasting, paratroop drops, Mulberry artificial harbors, Pluto fuel pipelines, deception operations under Operation Fortitude, and massive stockpiles of ammunition and vehicles staged in Britain. The mechanics of Overlord show what military contribution meant in modern war. Roughly 156,000 Allied troops crossed to Normandy on D-Day itself. More than 5,000 ships and landing craft, nearly 11,000 aircraft, and extensive airborne operations supported the assault. American forces landed at Utah and Omaha beaches. British and Canadian forces landed at Gold, Juno, and Sword. Omaha's heavy casualties revealed how fragile amphibious planning could become under machine gun fire, mines, and coastal fortification. Yet once the beachheads held, Allied logisticians rapidly unloaded men, tanks, trucks, food, and fuel in quantities Germany could not reverse. The breakout after Operation Cobra in late July, the liberation of Paris in August, and the sustained advance toward Germany depended on that logistical success. American air power reinforced the ground campaign. Strategic bombing from Britain and Italy targeted oil facilities, transportation networks, aircraft plants, and urban industrial centers. Bomber crews suffered high losses, and the ethics of area bombing remained debated, but the operational effect on German fuel supply and transport capacity was severe by 1944. American convoy protection in the Atlantic, aided by radar, sonar, escort carriers, and code breaking against U-boat communications, also proved decisive. Germany could not defeat Britain or sustain a maritime war once Allied shipping losses fell and production outran sinking. The Atlantic became a highway rather than a graveyard, which made the invasion of France materially possible. Ground logistics after the landings remained equally decisive. Cherbourg had to be opened, artificial Mulberry harbors had to absorb cargo until French ports were usable, and the Red Ball Express began hauling fuel, ammunition, and rations eastward in August 1944. With thousands of trucks and heavily black enlisted driver units operating under exhausting schedules. A mechanized army moving across France consumed gasoline at astonishing rates, and pauses in the advance often reflected supply strain as much as enemy action. American contribution in Europe therefore rested on a transportation web stretching from Midwestern factories to Atlantic convoys, British depots, Norman beach dumps, truck columns, and forward repair teams. Eisenhower's order of the day, issued before D-Day, called the soldiers, sailors, and airmen of the Allied Expeditionary Force to the Great Crusade and promised that the eyes of the world are upon you. The order functioned as morale, but it also identified the scale of expectation resting on the invasion. Overlord had to succeed because a failed landing would prolong the war, strain the alliance with the Soviet Union, and delay the destruction of Nazi power in Western Europe. The scale of American production sat behind that command confidence. By 1944, the United States had produced hundreds of thousands of trucks, tens of thousands of tanks and self-propelled guns, and a flood of transport aircraft that allowed airborne operations and medical evacuation on a scale earlier armies could not duplicate. The Army Service Forces under General Brecken Somervell managed procurement, storage, and movement through depots that linked factories to theaters. The contribution to victory was therefore cumulative: code-breaking, carrier doctrine, convoy defense, amphibious assault, truck transport, engineering, and atomic research all depended on a federal state that could schedule output across continents. On the eve of D-Day, Eisenhower handed Allied troops a message headed Order of the Day and told them, "The eyes of the world are upon you," and that the hopes and prayers of liberty-loving people everywhere march with you. Those lines were built for men climbing into landing craft under blackout conditions, not for detached reflection. The text sanctified Operation Overlord as liberation, steadied morale, and fused sacrifice to a moral vocabulary of freedom against Nazi rule. Its language belonged to a coalition invasion that depended on timing tables, embarkation orders, weather windows, and the promise that the men going ashore were carrying civilization with them. That message grows harder once the war record moves from Normandy to the Manhattan Project. American war capacity also produced a secret apparatus under the Army Corps of Engineers, with Leslie Groves supervising Oak Ridge uranium enrichment, Hanford plutonium production, and Los Alamos design and assembly under J. Robert Oppenheimer. More than 100,000 workers labored inside compartments of secrecy that few fully understood. Trinity on July 16, 1945, proved the implosion design. By then, Germany had surrendered, but Japan had not, and the instrument available to Truman was no longer an amphibious armada alone. It was a device built to erase a city in seconds. The timing of August 1945 put those two forms of war power inside one decision chain. Truman reached Potsdam after Roosevelt's death, received word of the successful test, watched Japan resist unconditional surrender, and awaited Soviet entry into the Pacific War. American planners anticipated severe casualties for Operation Olympic against Kyushu and later Operation Coronet against Honshu, though estimates varied. Curtis LeMay's firebombing had already burned Japanese cities, and submarine warfare had strangled shipping. On August 6th, Hiroshima was destroyed by a uranium bomb. On August 8th, the Soviet Union entered the war and invaded Manchuria. On August 9th, Nagasaki was destroyed by a plutonium bomb. Japan accepted surrender on August 15th and signed formally on September 2nd. Even that final blow rested on logistical habits familiar from every other campaign. Tinian required runways, fuel storage, guarded ordnance zones, and specialized assembly spaces for the 509th Composite Group. Bomb components crossed oceans through tightly secured depots before they were fitted for Enola Gay and Boxcar. Eisenhower's Great Crusade language therefore sits beside a second record written in engineering diagrams, security clearances, and blast yields. The same state that promised liberation at Normandy also built a terminal weapon under layers of secrecy, then used it against civilian centers under pressure to end the war, before invasion and before the post-war balance shifted again. American contribution to Axis defeat ended in victory and in transformed global responsibility. In Europe, U.S. troops joined occupation, reconstruction, and the Nuremberg process. In the Pacific, occupation under MacArthur reshaped Japanese politics, military institutions, and constitutional arrangements. Those roles were possible because American war capacity had built transport systems, shipping screens, air networks, and production flows large enough to sustain rule after combat. The war also left behind bases, research networks, and military institutions suited for permanent global reach. Carrier groups, strategic bombers, amphibious doctrine, and nuclear weapons moved directly into the Cold War. The Manhattan Project forced policymakers to think in terms of deterrence, stockpiles, and scientific competition, while Overlord, Midway, and the Pacific Advance became operational models for future joint planning and theater command. Demobilization proved the same point in reverse. Millions of service members had to be moved home, while others stayed in Germany, Japan, Italy, and island support zones, and military governments managed prisoners, surrender terms, port reconstruction, and displaced persons along the way. Victory itself generated obligations that only a vast administrative system could carry. That leaves the final judgment unsettled rather than triumphant. If modern victory depends on factories, bases, laboratories, and occupations as much as on battlefield courage, then the question reaches beyond whether the United States helped defeat the Axis. The harder question is what kind of global power it had to become in order to win, and whether a nation can build that machinery without carrying it into the next war.
If you're curious how I'm using AI to build these lectures and reshape higher education, visit thelibertytolearn.com. I'll see you in class.